Russia.
It's Russia interfering in the election.
Russia has been making headlines in American news outlets ever since news broke of their interference in the 2016 US presidential elections. And we can forgive you for thinking that Russia's way of projecting power is through espionage or its military, or even through strongman Vladimir Putin. But in reality, Russia projects its power through the energy sector. In this case, natural gas. In the 1970s and 80s, the Soviet Union discovered large gas reserves in Siberia. And, well, what did they do with it? They exploited it, of course. And in 1989, the Soviet Union would create its first ever state-run corporate enterprise, Gazprom. But 2 years later, the Soviet Union would eventually collapse, and its collapse would lead to the formation of Russia into what it is today. But it also led to the loss of territories like Ukraine. And this wave of change would eventually lead to Gazprom being transformed into a public company in 1993. But things didn't start well for this new company. Rampant theft and corruption behind the scenes nearly ended things for Gazprom in the 90s. But by the early 2000s, things, well, they were about to change. You see, when Gazprom was formed into a public company, the Russian government had kept 38% of it. And in June of 2000, Vladimir Putin became the president of Russia. And Putin, well, he went after Gazprom. When Putin took over as president, he needed to establish full control over the country, and he did that with the National Champions policy. This allowed Putin to basically hand out monopolies to a few people as long as they stayed loyal to him. Well, except for these guys. This guy's basically dead, along with a bunch of these guys. And you know what that reminds me of? But back to Gazprom. Since the Russian government had a majority share in Gazprom, and since Putin was president, well, he cleaned house. And thanks to Putin, things were starting to look good for Gazprom. The Russian government had increased its share to 50%, and they were able to reclaim assets that had been stolen in the previous years. And with Gazprom finally under control, Putin gave the company a monopoly over all Russian gas exports, provided the company with tax exemptions, and even helped the company with long-term contracts in Europe. And you'd think things would only get better from here, right? Well, not exactly. Before we talk about the gas wars, I'm gonna apologize ahead if I oversimplify things, because the politics behind it, well, it's just too large and complex to cover in one video. Historically, Ukraine and Russia don't particularly like each other, and that's not without merit. You see, during the rise of the Soviet Union, this murderous maniac had created the famine genocide of 1932 in Ukraine. And this horrific act of brutality caused mass malnutrition amongst the Ukrainians, and millions died from starvation. So when Ukraine gained its independence after the collapse of the Soviet Union, it had held a third of the Soviet Union's nuclear arsenal, as well as the former Soviet Black Sea Fleet that was stationed at the city of Sevastopol in Crimea. So now you can see just how much leverage Ukraine had over Russia. And when Gazprom was initially created, Ukraine was part of the Soviet Union, so naturally their pipelines ran through Ukraine before it reached Europe. But after the Soviet Union broke up in the 1990s, gas supplies to Europe, well, they still had to go through Ukraine. And this gave them an idea. They simply stopped paying for their gas bill. So Russia said, hey, you have to pay. And they said, no. So Gazprom cuts them off. Which eventually led to Ukraine to steal directly from the pipelines going to Europe and reselling the gas they stole. So Russia said, hey, you don't have to pay us if you return our ships and our nukes. Ukraine said, hell no. This back and forth continued for several years, eventually infuriating Western European countries when Gazprom cut off gas supplies in 2006 and 2009, which caused massive disruptions in gas supplies to countries like Germany. As with any crisis, there's an abundance of finger-pointing. Some say it was Russia's way of controlling Ukraine. Some say the US was behind it. Whatever the case was, in the end, the international community gave Ukraine the money to pay their gas debt. And in exchange, Gazprom would have to pay more to send gas through Ukraine to Europe. And by 2010, Russia had offered Ukraine a discount on their gas. And in exchange, Russia would get to keep its naval base in Crimea a little longer, which made everyone happy. Because even without nukes or warships, Ukraine understood the importance of the gas pipelines running through their country, using it as a tool to force Russia into submission, and at the same time making overtures to become part of the European Union, but more importantly, a member of NATO. This was something Russia simply couldn't allow, and to secure Gazprom's revenue, the influence Russian gas has over Europe, Russia developed Nord Stream to counter Ukraine's growing interest in joining the EU. And fast forward to 2014, things for Ukraine, well, they were about to get worse. Ukraine was still struggling to pay its gas debt, and that same year, the Russian military would invade and take over Crimea, followed by Russia starting a proxy war with Ukraine, and shortly after, gas supplies to Ukraine would stop. If there's one takeaway Russia had from the gas wars, it's to sell directly to your customers, and they did that with projects like Blue Stream to supply Turkey, and the vital Nord Stream pipeline which runs under the Baltic Sea to supply Western Europe. And as of the making of this video, Gazprom is currently developing Nord Stream 2 and Turk Stream to feed Europe's growing addiction to Russian natural gas. While Europe is Gazprom's largest market at over 81%, there's a new player on the global energy stage, and that's China. China's explosive growth over the years has benefited some of the world's economies. Countries in Africa, and countries like Pakistan and Bangladesh have all benefited from China taking on a larger presence in global politics. But more importantly, China has been aggressively securing the natural resources it needs to fuel its growth. In 2014, Gazprom signed a deal to supply the Asian giant with natural gas for the next 30 years. While building across the Siberian waste was originally thought to be prohibitively expensive, the $400 billion deal, suddenly makes building a new gas pipeline across Siberia to China possible. And we're not talking about waiting for a decade here. The Power of Siberia pipeline is set to supply natural gas to China by December of 2019. So what about the latest US sanctions on Russia? You see, Gazprom is still a publicly traded company in the US, London, and Germany. You heard that right. You can buy shares of Gazprom in Europe and as an over-the-counter stock in the US. On top of that, Gazprom has subsidiaries in almost every country in Europe, which means in order for Europe to secure its gas supplies, countries like Germany will continue to support Gazprom, regardless of sanctions or outcry from its allies. With new projects like Nord Stream 2 and Turk Stream and the Power of Siberia pipeline nearing completion, Gazprom is set to dominate the energy markets of both the East and the West.